Hello, welcome to the Bitcoin Standard podcast. Our guest today is Aaron van Wirdum. Aaron is the author of the Genesis book, a book on the early roots of Bitcoin, the people and the projects that shaped Bitcoin. He's also the editor-in-chief of Bitcoin magazine, and he's been a journalist writing about Bitcoin for 10 years. Aaron, it's a pleasure to have you.
Hey, Saif. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you've written a very interesting book, which is really informative about the almost the sociology or maybe the anthropology of Bitcoin and the emergence of this idea among this tribe of Homo sapiens at this particular time. I think it covers a very interesting subject, which books like the Bitcoin Standard don't really get into. So you provide some nice depth to the ideas of Austrian economics and Keynesian economics, which most Austrian books would get to the point of discussing the economics and not get into the history of how these ideas developed. But you begin the book with a discussion of the Austrians in particular, and you discuss how Hayek emerged from Vienna and how his ideas helped shape essentially Bitcoin over time, many years after his death. So I guess let's begin with that. That's the best fit for our audience, I'm sure. And then we'll talk about some of the other parts of the book.
Yeah. So, so the Genesis book it's kind of the prehistory of Bitcoin, right? It tells the story of where Bitcoin came from and the people that were working on projects like Bitcoin and what they were interested in and what they tried to achieve. And when I started writing this book, I did not realize how big of a part Hayek in specific was going to be. I knew that he was going to be somewhere in the early stages of the book, specifically because he wrote The Denationalization of Money, which I think is a very influential work, especially in the context of Bitcoin, right? Separating money and state. But as I was writing the book and as I was doing my research, I kind of increasingly realized how big of an influence he had. Like, he had a very direct influence on a lot of the people that were actually trying to create digital cash. Like, they were directly inspired by Hayek. Like, they quote Hayek. They were really trying to realize this vision that he had of separating money and state in particular, but also the broader vision, the free market economic ideals that Hayek described. And specifically, so what I do in the book is I really kind of, much like what you do in the Bitcoin Standard as well, you describe the history of money, right? And I really try to do that from a Hayekian perspective as well. So I sort of explain the evolution of money and then how he thought about that and his critique on that. And as I was studying that, I was finding quite a lot that was very relevant for Bitcoin. Like, even in Hayek's early days, which I think not a lot of people know, but even then he was describing this sort of neutral idea of money, which was a money that would be international, borderless, and would have a limited supply. Well, obviously that's very relevant for Bitcoin. I think the reason this is not very well known that Hayek was talking about this is because he was not a big advocate of it, because he didn't really think it was possible. Really, he thought that's not realistic for a couple of reasons. Like, one reason is he thought fractional reserve banking was gonna happen, and therefore, a limited supply is kind of what do you call it, devalued because of that intrinsically. And also, there was no, you can't have an institution, a central institution that manages this money, because this institution would have to be based somewhere in some country, and then they can be corrupted or something. In the worst case, in the case of war, for example, how is this institution gonna keep money limited if the government wants to print money to fund its war, for example? Like, how are you going to make sure that keeps working in the worst cases? So if it can't work in the worst cases, you can never really trust it, right?
Yeah.
So he was not like a big.
Are you describing here his earlier work in the 1930s or the 1970s? Denationalization of money,
Yeah, so now I'm
or
speaking specifically about the 1930s, where he was talking
okay,
about these ideas, and he was not, like I said, he was not like a big advocate of it because he thought it wasn't possible for the
yeah.
most part. So
But
it's sort of
was
his
he?
note on
He
the.
I think maybe his my favorite Hayek book is a very obscure book of lectures that he wrote in the 1930s. It's called "Monetary Nationalism and International
Mhm.
Stability." That was, I think, that was the best work by Hayek, and it was one of the first books that I read, and it was really, really eye-opening. And it's not very popular; few people know about it compared to his more recent work.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that was a series of lectures originally, right? That
Yes.
have been transcribed. Yeah, I quote that in the Genesis book as well, so I get into that as well. Indeed. So these are like early Hayek ideas. And I do think these are already relevant to Bitcoin, but like you said, like these lectures have been kind of forgotten, and then his advocacy for, or at least his explanation of a neutral money with a limited supply, also kind of forgotten in part because he himself wasn't even advocating for it very much. And then we get later in his career where you have the denationalization of money. So now he starts to advocate for separating money and state very explicitly, right? So leaving money to the free market. And his argument is if you leave money to the free market, then the best form of money will spontaneously emerge. It will be adopted, organically, as other products in the free market as well. So the best money will just win out if there is a free market of money. And then, of course, you get in the last stage, and now we're like in the 90s, where he actually believed that was not, or probably not going to be possible because governments were not going to allow that, right? Because governments are the ones that benefit the most from the money printer. They benefit the most from the monopoly on money, obviously. And if you want a free market for money, then governments are going to have to allow that. And he was, becoming more bearish on that even being possible. So then he started to advocate that actually, in order to make this happen, in order to make a free market money happen, it needs to be something that governments cannot stop. This is the famous Hayek quote, which I begin the Genesis book with, and sort of get back to later in the book. So there's sort of these three distinct phases of Hayek's thinking about free market money or about money in general that I think are all very relevant for Bitcoin. So yeah, that's why he's kind of the main overarching character, at least the main overarching economist in the book.
So, which of these views do you think is the most pro Bitcoin, or which one would be the most in agreement with how Bitcoin works in your mind?
I would say, ultimately, I would say the separation of money and state. All three of them. I have to choose? But yeah,
Well,
fundamentally, if you would ask me in sort of one sentence, what is the fundamental thing that Bitcoin does, then I would say it's separating money and state. So from that perspective, I would say that's probably the most, core idea of Hayek's that Bitcoin sort of represents.
yeah, it's just for me, I would say that it would be closer to the earlier formulation of the 1930s when he discussed the role of gold as an international neutral monetary asset, precisely because it resisted inflation. Whereas in the 1970s, even though I think it was great that he was discussing the idea of denationalization of money, and I think he did an incredible job of promoting it and getting people to think about it, because up until the 1970s, that was just completely outside the Overton window. And I think I think he was a little clever. Maybe I'm cynical here, but I suspect from World War II up until he won the Nobel Prize, I don't think Hayek really wrote about money or
Hmm.
about inflation. I think he chose to focus on philosophy to lay the groundwork for the realization of the ideas of spontaneous order and emergence and prices and economic calculation and so on. And then once he won the Nobel Prize and once he became, or I should say, the Bank of Sweden Prize in memory of Alfred Nobel, which pretends to be a Nobel Prize, but people treat it like a Nobel Prize. And I think he knew what he was doing. Once he won that, suddenly he realized, hey, why don't we take the money out of the hands of the government? Now that I have a Nobel and you can't just cancel me, I'm just going to put this out there. And obviously, I admire that a lot, and I think it took a lot of bravery. But there is something, if you read his book, Denationalization of Money, his conception of how this is going to be solved was that we would have some sort of board that would specify that the currency unit would correspond to a certain quantity of basket of a certain percentage of a basket of goods made up of a bunch of goods. So there would be some basically socialist central planning board that would decide that the money had to correspond, the value of the money had to correspond to the commodities that people used and bought, which in my mind is a horrible idea. And
No, no, that's not correct. You're half correct, or at least let's see if we agree on this. No, what he was describing was indeed. Well, I don't know what you mean by board. Like, it wasn't a government institution that was going to do this. He very explicitly said it would be private
yes,
banks essentially that would determine this, right?
exactly. But he was saying the way that they would do it is that they would
Yeah.
dictate the value of the currency in terms of those market commodities,
Yes,
which
right.
which
That
in
is
my
that is
mind is basically misses the point of money, because what would happen in this case is, I think if I were to play this thought experiment out and to try and explain why I don't think it works and why I think he was mistaken there, is if you're trying to do this, then the only way that you're going to be able to maintain the rate of the currency against all these commodities is to start accumulating those commodities, start buying them in order to maintain the rate with all of your money.
But
Because the
why?
value of your money goes up, and then you need to maintain it pegged in terms of corn and bread and so on.
Mhm.
And so then the people who make corn and bread keep making more and more and more. But since you have to maintain the value, you start stocking that stuff. So stocking market commodities becomes the only way for you to be a market maker that guarantees the price of your currency in terms of those commodities.
Well, first of all, as far as Hayek concerned, like whatever the free market does, that is fine.
Yeah,
Actually, right?
well, I'm just
However,
let me carry this forward to see if this happens. Okay, so then this happens,
but
and now
hang
you've
on, hang
got
on. No, let me stop you there real quick. Why, if the value of the money goes up in comparison to this basket of goods, can the private bank that's issuing this currency not just print more money to make the value stable again? Like, that's what Hayek was suggesting in the denationalization of money. He was suggesting that is what would happen.
yes, but they need to still maintain a particular exchange rate between particular goods, and the only way that they're going to be able to maintain that, if there's a commodity and people are able to buy it and sell it, and they have a commitment to try and maintain a peg to it, they need to have a stockpile, and they need to be buying and selling from the stockpile in order to be able to affect the price, just like what foreign central banks do with dollars. How can they maintain the value of their currency against the dollar? They set up a market in the dollars. So what I'm trying to say is, if they're trying to do this, the best thing that they're going to be able to do in order to try and commit to making it a fixed market commodity would be in a market to stock up on gold and just say our money is going to be this much gold, and then they keep buying up more gold.
I don't
As the
think so.
price of gold, as the price of their money goes up, they just need to buy more gold, because gold is the best reserve asset. So I guess what he was trying to say at that point is he was trying to find a way to, I believe, not sound like a gold bug, because I think he thought at that point gold was probably too much of a lost cause, and I think he may have thought that it was not a politically feasible strategy, or maybe he was just being, politically correct and trying to lead them to a conclusion that would lead them to gold, without explicitly saying gold. But ultimately, what he's describing as a monetary authority that sets price against the basket commodity, that basket of commodities is the monetary standard. So instead of going on a gold standard or a silver standard, you're going on a bread and corn and other commodities standard. So if that were the case, ultimately the best monetary standard is going to win on the free market, and you go back to having a gold standard. And I think that's just where I would say the disagreement is with this kind of recent vision, which is, you'll see it. I once did a podcast a long time ago.
But sorry, I
Yeah,
want to
go
stop
ahead.
you because I still don't understand, and maybe your audience does, or maybe they don't. In which case, it's
Okay.
good to repeat this. So, if the value of the money goes up in relation to whatever basket of goods is determined by this private bank. So there's indeed a board at the private bank that says this is going to be the basket of goods we're going to use to measure it against. Now they're issuing money. So for example, the basket of goods is worth 100 of these currency units. Now the value of this money goes up. So now it's like 98 currency units. So this board sees this. So now they know, okay, we got to make more money to bring it back to 100, right? That's how you can keep it stable. At least that's how Hayek suggests you would keep it stable, and vice versa. So if the basket of goods is now worth 102 currency units, you got to extract some money out of the economy and then you bring it back to 100 again. So that's simply how he would foresaw this being managed. There would be no actual backing of the currency. It would just be changing the supply to keep it stable with whatever basket of goods they themselves selected.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesafehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Daylight Computer. I love to work early in the morning and late at night, or in the sun outdoors, but regular computer screens are terrible at these times, and they strain your eyes. For years, I've wanted a paper-like electronic screen on a simple computer I could use to write. I tried several models, but none were very good. Now, finally, Daylight have delivered a fantastic full-function tablet with a paper-like screen that's easy on your eyes and great for outdoor use. I've been using the Daylight computer to write my next book, and it is absolutely fantastic, and it has led me to invest in this company myself. Check out my interview with Anjan Kata in episode 249.
Yeah, but I don't think that you can manage to make it hypothetically equal to a very particular basket of goods unless you make it redeemable for that basket of goods in a certain way. You need to be making a market with it. Because what is it that gives my credit value that is going to determine that this is going to be worth this much on the market? Why should it be worth
people,
this much?
Right? People holding the currency, that's where the demand comes from. That's where the value comes from.
Okay, so then one bank is offering me this piece of paper that they are saying is always going to be able to buy you those things. Whereas one bank is saying, I'm going to offer you this piece of paper, which you can then redeem for a physical quantity of gold.
Mm-hmm.
That's ultimately the market competition here.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I see it is that anybody can make a piece of paper that says we're going to provide it in this price. And then these papers are very easy to create. And then the value of these papers is likely going to continue to approach the cost of production. Whereas the value of the paper that is redeemable for a form of money, where it's a receipt for hard money, which is a receipt for a commodity, you could make it, I think what would happen is that you would have these monies then become redeemable in different commodities in order to guarantee that you're able to make it match this price. So this would be, you can redeem it for this much copper, or you can redeem it for this much corn, or so on. But these commodities themselves change. So then you're running a monetary standard that's based on easy commodities that people are going to be producing more and more and more and more of.
Well, so first of all, Hayek said that this is also possible, and he thought that it would probably start off like this. But he actually, like in opposition to you, it's like the other way around. He said over time, people would sort of just start to trust these currencies. And the reason they wouldn't be printed ad infinitum is because there's several private banks in competition with each other. So if one currency starts to be inflated too much, then people would, switch to a different bank. It's like any other goods in the economy. It's like, as long as there's competition, that kind of keeps the producers honest. That was his theory. By the way, we both agree that this idea doesn't really have much to do with Bitcoin. So in this,
Well, it
here I-
kind of does, because it is.
Okay.
I think it does. It is relevant to an important point, and I think it's a point that the shitcoiners would bring up in favor of shitcoining, and that's why I believe you find more overlap between some shitcoining multi-coiners and Hayek, because the point is this: ultimately, people are going to. There's a monetary premium that goes into money. And I think this is the point that is missed here. So if people are using copper as money, then they're adding enormously to the demand for copper, because they're buying copper and storing it on top of all the industrial demand that's there. So then when you're fixing the price of your currency to these commodities, you're going to stimulate more and more production of those commodities. You're making a commitment to be buying those commodities at this price, and as the value of your currency increases.
No one's making that commitment.
Well, effectively, you're telling people that you're always going to be able to make this much copper. You're always going to be able to exchange this money for that much copper. This is effectively similar to running a Bitcoin copper standard. So then how are you able to redeem all of that copper? The best way to do that would be to start accumulating a stockpile in copper. Then you soon realize that copper miners are making copper to give to people to run copper monetary standards. And that's not doing as good a job as just holding gold, because storing gold is much better than storing copper. So this is, for me, this is relevant to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is a market commodity. Bitcoin is similar to gold like this. Whereas the Hayek vision is more of a sort of multi-coin vision, or we just have a crypto oracle that determines what prices are, rather than just have the money be a commodity in the market with people buying it and selling it, which Hayek sort of doesn't really explain. I mean, he provides an explanation for why he thinks gold doesn't quite cut it, but it's mostly a political explanation, I think.
Yeah, well, so I still kind of I don't really see why you think that making a currency stable also represents a claim on the goods. But the other point about multi-coinery, so I think that's very that's at least kind of true. Sorry, I should turn off my notifications here. That's at least kind of true for his first book, or the original, the Denationalization of Money. He sort of describes this idea of currency competition. Really, like there's just these different private banks that are issuing all these competing currencies, and now it really sounds like multi-coinery. However, in the argument refined, so that was refined, the book he published 2 or 3 years later, I believe. There he kind of extends this logic, and he starts there he describes that ultimately, what would really happen is that the market, people, users of the money, they would ultimately settle on some standard that is considered most neutral, most stable, and ultimately that standard would then be copied by every other private bank. They would also just sort of converge into one stable denomination of money, and he described that as becoming kind of this meta money, sort of all compassing, like that. This is just the money standard. He has a term for that, which I'm forgetting right now. And now, if you ask me, it does start to sound more maximalist. Like now, it's there is some competition, but the competition just converges on one, in the same way that I think a maximalist would say, or at least I'm not for banning altcoins. I just think ultimately the market will settle on one standard value. So that's still, I think, a relevant analogy there.
Yeah, he can. I mean, he may have, if he was around today, he may have shitcoined for his first couple of years, maybe. But I think eventually he would have seen the light. I think we both agree on that, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people do, right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we all shitcoin to some degree. We use dollars and other fiat currencies, so we all live in glass houses when it comes to shitcoins, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, the other interesting point about that to say about that. So that's the other big theme that's sort of weaved throughout the Genesis book is this idea of spontaneous order,
Mhm.
right? So how without any central authority, a diverse group of people can still settle on one standard, essentially. So language is a good example of that. There's no government institution that mandates, exactly or historically has mandated how the English language should work exactly. It's just, it emerged through people speaking the language. And something similar happens with the economy at large, right? There's no, at least free market economies, right? There's no central planner, but still resources are allocated throughout society efficiently through this bottom-up, free market mechanism. And something similar can be argued about, in Hayek's case, sort of this monetary standard that would emerge. And I make the case that you can sort of see Bitcoin itself through that context as well. It's sort of this bottom-up thing that people adopt voluntarily. They run the code that they choose to run, and still it's all in so far in perfect harmony, pretty much, and everyone agrees on. Every 10 minutes there's a new block, and it works without any central authority. So that's another big Hayekian theme, I would say, that's very relevant to Bitcoin as well.
Yeah, this one particular idea from Hayek was one thing that I encountered very early in my conversion to Austrian economics. So I would say this was back when I was still in grad school in the late 20 noughties. And I first came across Karl Popper. He led me to Hayek, and that was the gateway drug, Popper. But one of the earliest ideas that I
They
came
were
across,
contemporaries as well, right?
yeah, and
Yeah.
Popper was heavily influenced by Hayek. I think
Right.
when you read the two, I think you see that Popper got more from Hayek. But when I started reading Hayek, one of the earliest ideas was this idea of spontaneous order as something that results from the actions of individuals rather than the design of individuals. And honestly, this was one of maybe the most eye-opening ideas that you could encounter. It really changes the way that you think about the world, because particularly for people who are educated, and at that point in my life, I had spent my entire life practically in education institutes. I went straight from school to university to graduate school, and I was about to finish my university. And it's almost like puberty for the brain, in my opinion, when your brain goes from that kind of schoolboy mentality of everything is a paper and pen problem that can just be solved by a smart engineering mind, to then realizing, no, actually, there are a lot of things in life that aren't designed, can't be designed. And the way that they work is that they emerge from people's actions. And it's just such a very powerful concept to understand, because it really helps you understand so much about the world. And it's very difficult for so many people who haven't read Hayek to grasp it. This is why Hayek can be so influential for people, because it's like you've opened up another eye with which to see things that you couldn't see before. Because now you can see that things like language, they don't evolve because there's always a certain authority that's there dictating what's going on. It evolves through people's use day to day, and things that work stick and things that don't work fail. And a lot of things are like that. Language, Hayek discusses how law is essentially like that. And
Yeah.
particularly in the legal tradition in Britain, the common law tradition, it emerges like that. And it's a very different perspective from looking at it. And there's another great book by another economist who won the Bank of Sweden Prize in memory of Alfred Nobel, which people mistakenly call a Nobel Prize. His name is Vernon Smith, and he wrote a great book called Rationality in Economics. And he was an experimental economist, so he used to do experiments in a lab, and he looked at students and produced all kinds of valuable insights on economic behavior from a lab. And toward the end of his career, he came across Hayek for the first time and the Austrians, and his mind was blown because he found through his experiments essentially what they had been arguing for many decades before. And in particular, what he found was that people manage to find the market equilibrium. Markets work without all of the criteria that economists in the 20th century had imposed on how markets should work, which is usually the criterion that people use in order to justify government intervention and government regulation, that there needs to be a legal and regulatory framework for markets to happen. And Vernon Smith was showing how even if you don't meet those criteria, you just have random people meet in a certain situation where they just simply have the seller has a willingness to sell price, and the buyer has a price at which he is willing to buy. And you put a bunch of buyers and sellers in a room, and they find the equilibrium, even if they don't have all of the assumptions that the standard mainstream model of economics says that they have. And so then he only really made grand sense of that when he read Hayek and saw how Hayek explained that the market is a spontaneous order that emerges not because somebody designs it. And it was decades of reading and experimenting as a university professor in this in order to arrive at this conclusion. It's a really, really good book. I highly recommend it.
When was this? I've heard of it vaguely, but I've never read it or looked into it closely.
I think it was published around, you know what, I have it here. I think it was published around 2008 or so, 2007.
Right. Fairly recently.
Yeah, I have it somewhere, but I can't find it. But yeah,
but he won the Nobel honorary thing for that?
Yes.
For that research, right? Okay.
Yeah, well, he won it for the experimental research, and his experimental research had gone on for decades, since the 1950s, so practically 50 years of research up until, I think, 2007. He won it in the same year.
All this time he was unaware of Hayek's work?
Pretty much until like the late stages of it.
That's very telling of how criminally under taught Hayek is, and Austrians in general, but Hayek in specific, maybe.
Absolutely. Oh, Hayek is the most read of the Austrians.
Yeah. He's the most mainstream of the bunch, but even he is very on.
Yeah, but I mean, it's if you're a university professor in economics, you almost certainly only hear about Hayek in caricatures by other economists. You never come across his own writing. But another, he won the Nobel or the Bank of Sweden prize in the same year as Daniel Kahneman, I think. I'm pretty sure they won it in the same year. And
Hayek or
no, Vernon Smith.
Okay, Hayek also shared it with who shared? Who did he share with? Do you know this from the top of your head?
I think it was Gunnar Myrdal, socialist Swede, Swedish socialist.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
And in the same way, Vernon Smith shared it with Daniel Kahneman, whose conclusions are effectively the exact opposite, because Kahneman is all about how humans are irrational, and if you leave them alone, they do bad things, so therefore they need economists and politicians to tell them what to do. It's basically the summary of his life's work. And Vernon Smith's work is, no, actually humans can figure out what to do a lot better when they have the options to choose for themselves rather than have their choices imposed upon them from above. Another one, also coincidentally, another author who also recently credited Hayek is Brian Arthur from the Santa Fe Institute for the Study of Complexity. And this was a pretty big field of people with the emergence of computer science who started discussing big data and complexity and complex phenomena. And they had some of those state-of-the-art research for a pretty long period. And there's an interview with Reason Magazine where Brian Arthur is told, he says basically, several people, when we started publishing our results, several people contacted us and told us, hey, have you guys heard of the Austrians? You should check them out. You'll find them cool. They pretty much argued the same thing. And he said, I was surprised, but I picked up Mises and Hayek, and essentially they had arrived at the same conclusions that we had arrived at after years of studying mathematical complexity science. And I think it's truly criminally under followed and underread. It's great that Hayek is getting so much more attention because of Bitcoin, not just for Bitcoin and for money, but also for his work on philosophy of science, for his work on economics, economic philosophy, economic history, all kinds of very interesting work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I went to university. I didn't study economics specifically. I studied history, but I did study sort of a more political economic branch of within the history department, and I did not come across Hayek ever once during my years there, which it's telling and it's a shame. And but that's the world we apparently live in right now.
Yeah, well, it's their loss. These universities, they're the ones that are missing out on all the fun. Um, okay, now you say that there is that quote, which I also quote in the Bitcoin Standard, where Hayek says, "Oh, I don't think we can have it unless we can buy some slide. We can have good money unless if by some sly roundabout manner we manage to build something that they cannot stop."
Yeah, let me
And
read it because I have it right here. So
yeah,
I don't believe that we shall ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government. Since we can't take them violently out of the hands of government, all we can do is, by some sly roundabout way, introduce something they can't stop.
beautiful. Now, it's really, as an Austrian, Austrian economist, not an Austrian nationality, to be clear. I would like to think that somewhere in 2007, somebody read this quote and decided to set out and build Bitcoin. It would be nice. But realistically, though, as somebody who studied this period, just how much was this the motivation, in your opinion, of um, Bitcoin in particular, but I would say in general, the cypherpunks and the broader encryption, not just the monetary aspect of it and not just the money aspect, but the broader cypherpunk movement. How much of it do you think was really motivated specifically by these kind of Austrian ideas of taking money out of the hands of the state versus more, shall we say, applied libertarian ideals like, getting around government control and illegal transactions and things like that?
No, quite a lot, I would argue. Now, I haven't spoken with Satoshi Nakamoto himself. That I don't know for sure. But definitely a lot of the people that were working on these kinds of projects and technologies, several of them were definitely very aware of Hayek's work and quoted it like explicitly. So one chapter of the Genesis book in particular is about extropians, actually. So the extropians are kind of the predecessors of the cypherpunks, and there's several cypherpunks that were also extropians, including Tim May, Nick Szabo, Wide-Eye, Halvini. Um, Probably, yeah, but more, but like about there was a bunch of overlap. Like basically, the cypherpunks emerged from the hackers and the extropians, kind of starting to team up in a way in California.
Mm-hmm.
So the extropians, they were this futurist, utopian technologists that believed that through the rapid improvement of technology, humanity would come to actually transform themselves. It was this transhumanist movement, like technology would make it possible to cure all disease, cure all age, and then explore the universe. And they had this very libertarian idea, very like explicitly Hayek-based idea on how to achieve that, which is get the government out of the way, just let people freely experiment, and that's the fastest way to progress science and technology. This was very explicit, like it's part of their motto is spontaneous order, and Hayek is definitely part of it. So then at some point they had this magazine, and Hal Finney first started to promote the idea of digital cash to this group of people. And when Hal Finney first did that, to your point, he was approaching it from this idea of digital cash in the sense of a private way of paying online, a private way of paying online that governments cannot stop, essentially. So that these aspects of cash in a digital form. But and the reason he was promoting that, indeed, like you said, is sort of this general libertarian idea. Let's just get the government out of our life.
Applied libertarianism. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. However, after Hal Finney did that, there were other extropians, including the founder of the extropian movement, Max Moore, who sort of took this And he explicitly connected this to the Hayekian idea of separating money and state, denationalization of money. Like, he really proposed this to the extropians as an idea of, we can use this technology to create a form of money outside of the government, and you can realize this Hayekian idea. And he was talking, about the problems of fiat currency, like explicitly in this article, and putting a call to action to the extropians to use this digital cash technology to realize Hayek's ideas. And then in the cypherpunk movement itself, like, the cypherpunk movement was fairly diverse, right? There were people also from the cypherpunks that had different ideologies. They did have a very strong libertarian bent, and like I said, there were like a bunch of these extropian cypherpunks. But some of them were more radical. Some of them really had this idea of completely undermining the government through, evading taxes, for example, using digital cash to evade taxes, and ushering in a world where governments just become powerless. There were also more moderate cypherpunks that, they really cared about the privacy aspect. Like, they weren't necessarily out there to abolish all government, but at least they wanted to be able to communicate and transact privately within existing democratic societies. And there were even like some socialists there, and like, it was a more widely diverse group. But for sure, there were like a bunch of them, including Tim May, who was arguably, he was one of the founders of the cypherpunks and also the most active contributor there, and, very actively pushing for digital cash. And, digital cash in general was seen as a central project for the cypherpunks, really. And Tim May also very explicitly like quoted Hayek and, pointed out, he at one point he called Hayek like his big inspiration and the most important thing to read. And so, for sure, for sure, these Hayekian ideas were very present within the cypherpunk community. Now, some cypherpunks were maybe more or less interested in accomplishing this. Why Die is a good example of a cypherpunk that created a digital form of cash that did not really seem to have this goal of separating money and state, or at least, he was, well, maybe he did, but at least he wanted to create a form of money that explicitly had a stable value, I should say. So that's still separating money from state, but so there were different, they had a lot of different ideas of how these currencies should be valued. And so it was a diverse group of people, and they had their own ideas and their own motivations. But generally speaking, this Hayekian idea, including the separation of money specifically, was very present there. Like, the Extropians, one of their magazines, or the magazine I mentioned, they had on the cover, they had these Hayekian bills or something, with Hayek was like the face of, where a president is on a dollar bill, you know what I mean? They had this currency with like Hayek's face on it, and it was very explicitly intended as a free market currency, which they wanted to achieve through these kinds of technologies. So I don't know if not everyone who worked on digital currencies was equally motivated by that, but it was definitely one of the founding inspirations to even start thinking in that direction and start working on these kinds of projects, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
I think there's definitely intellectual influence there. Although I wonder how much Satoshi had, because if you read Satoshi, it seems like it wasn't really something that he was very familiar with. I think, he specifically says it would be appealing to the libertarian perspective, which suggests that he himself would not have considered himself a libertarian. And I don't think, he went into economic theory enough. And this is what I find really fascinating about money is that he invented what I believe is the best form of money ever, not because he read economic theory and realized that the Austrians were right and the Keynesians were wrong. He just thought about the problem from first principles as an engineer and thought of how he could make a money that would be that would work in the best way. And he realized that fixing the supply would be the best way to do it. And I think it's a very smart consideration.
Yeah, that's very possible, and I also don't make the claim in the Genesis book that Satoshi did that because of Hayek's writing or anything like that. Like I don't draw that direct lineage. I see it more as like an indirect lineage of ideas. Like it's an evolution of ideas over time, and I definitely think that Hayek's ideas have been a big part of the evolution of these ideas. They and what Satoshi did was ultimately, he brings together all these ideas that are out there, these different technologies that are out there, whether it's proof of work or the different mechanical ways that Bitcoin works that are based on, like, whether it's BitGold or B-Money, and he brings that together. So yeah, you are right that Satoshi never writes explicitly why he designed Bitcoin, or at least he doesn't himself reference to Hayek. But I do see it as a bigger story, and Bitcoin, I do see it as an evolutionary step within the story that Hayek also has a lot of influence on.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you walk us through the history of the technologies that got us to Bitcoin? Usually, a lot of people say, well, Bitcoin is the MySpace, and then my favorite shitcoin is going to be the Facebook. But in reality, there were many MySpaces before Bitcoin where people tried to make this. So what are the broad highlights of this journey, and who are the most important makers along the way?
Yeah, well, so I start the book to be clear. So the book has two storylines really, and they merge throughout the book. So it starts out with, on the one hand, economics, and then on the other hand, more the tech side. And that storyline starts out with the emergence of the hacker community at MIT, and free and open source software, basically. And then we move through the invention of public key cryptography. I covered the invention of timestamping, which is explicitly mentioned several times in the Bitcoin white paper. But then the main digital currency projects, to your MySpace analogy, the main digital currency projects that I cover are DigiCash or eCash, and then Hashcash, BitGold, B-Money, and ARPA. Do you want me to give like a once? How do you want to tackle this?
Yeah, I mean it's a lot of obviously technical details, but
Yes.
maybe just kind of an overview summary of how you think these things led to Bitcoin.
Yeah, so the first digital cash project, the first person to ever think of the idea of creating a form of digital cash was David Chaum. He founded the startup in Amsterdam, and his goal was really to make a form of digital money that can be used anonymously. So he was not motivated, like, he was not a Hayekian, right? He was not trying to separate money and state or anything like that. He was really there to create something that people can use to transact anonymously. That actually existed. Like, he launched that startup. That company existed for a while, and it was designed for banks. So banks would adopt it, and then banks, existing banks with existing fiat currencies, they would offer it to their customers as an option. You can just withdraw digital cash to your wallet, and you can then pay a merchant somewhere online or even offline. There were some at that time, because it was like the 80s and 90s. They were actually very focused on offline payments. Well, nowadays it's more natural to just think of digital currency as something for online. But in any case, so that was the first digital cash project, really. This was also an inspiration for the cypherpunks. So now the cypherpunks, they sort of saw that digital cash was possible, and they also wanted to create something like that. So they started playing around with eCash itself. There were issues there, like the startup failed, and also there were patent issues, so they couldn't just make their own versions of it. So then Adam Back, he started to promote this idea that the cypherpunks would just create their own forms of digital cash. And he himself created Hashcash. So Hashcash was meant as a postage scheme. The way it worked was you invest computing power, you prove that you made some calculations, hashes actually, and because you did that, you prove that you spent resources, and that would make spam very expensive. I think most of your listeners know this, but the idea would be right. So there were a lot of spammers out there, and the only way to make spam profitable is if you send out like 1 million emails. If you want to stop spam, then you could say, I will only accept emails that have a little bit of proof of work, Hashcash on them. For an individual that wants to send you a legitimate email, that's kind of fine. You just let your computer make a 1-second calculation. But for a spammer that has to do that 1 million of times, that becomes unprofitably pretty fast. So that's how you sort of keep the spammers out. Now, that was really the sort of postage, but it introduced this idea of digital scarcity. So now you had something in the digital world, unbacked by anything else. There was no fiat backing it, or there were no banks involved, like with DigiCash, eCash, but rather was this purely digital thing that was also provably scarce in a way, and that served as an inspiration for the cypherpunks to start using proof of work, Hashcash, to create their own forms of digital currency. So relatively quickly after the introduction of Hashcash, there was BitGold. So this was introduced by Nick Szabo. And Nick Szabo had this idea of making the Hashcash transferable through public key cryptography. So basically, you're signing a message that the Hashcash that you found now belongs to someone else. And then everyone is sort of decentralized, keeping track of who owns that. Everyone can verify that the signatures work out. Now, this was not a perfect system because double spends were possible, right? You can send the same transaction twice. Now someone has to determine which one is valid. He had some sort of idea of a voting system for that, but this was not perfect because it didn't solve for the Sybil attack, right? If someone can start to vote with like 1 million identities and outvote everyone else. So it was sort of this rough idea that, by the way, was not implemented, also because it didn't quite work. But it introduced this idea of transferring proof of work through public key cryptography, and to an extent making it decentralized. Everyone checks on everyone else. Then Wideye, he came up with the idea of B-money, which I mentioned earlier. B-money was designed to have a more stable purchasing power. So the Hashcash, the proof of work would only be accepted if there were new coins needed to keep it stable. But it was kind of an open question who was going to decide that. He had this interesting idea. It was really him had the first idea that it would be truly decentralized, like everyone would just keep track of it themselves. But again, it didn't solve the double spend problem. This was kind of this recurring thing. And then finally, before we get to Bitcoin, you have RPow. This was a project by Hal Finney, and now he took it back to a more centralized approach again, where you would produce proof of work. A central server would say, hey, if you produce proof of work, then I'm going to give you this coin. So you did that. You got a coin, which was really just a number. The central server would, keep this number in storage, and then when someone else would spend this number, they would check that it wasn't already spent. And the reason that what Hal Finney added to this was this concept of he really leaned into the open source ethos in a way, because this server had open source software. That's how you would know that it couldn't just create currency out of nothing. Like anyone could check this open source software. And specifically, the reason that anyone could check that this server was running open source software was because it used something called remote attestation, which meant that you could sort of ask the server. There was a chip embedded by IBM, and then this chip would, on request, sign the open source code or the hash of it, and that's how you could verify that it was actually doing what it was supposed to do. But this project had a problem that, well, several of these projects had the problem that inflation was not really solved. Like, as you produce more proof of work, you can produce more money. So if computers get faster, then it just inflates the whole system. So all of these projects, the important thing about that is that they all introduced an idea that's relevant to Bitcoin, or an interesting technology that sort of inspired Satoshi, or probably at least. So whether that's the concept of digital cash itself, using proof of work, having it be transferable through public key cryptography, having some ledger that keeps track of all of this in a decentralized way, using free and open source software to make sure that the project actually works as intended. Like, all these ideas you find in Bitcoin, and they sort of existed in these different digital cash projects before it. And yeah, to your point, I think it's one of the reasons this is interesting and important to know about is also because of this myth you mentioned, that Bitcoin is sort of the MySpace and there will be a better version of Bitcoin. Well, actually, there were several MySpaces. There were several digital cash projects that were either they didn't launch or they weren't very successful. And actually, Bitcoin seems to be the one that gets it right. Like, that seems to be the one that's actually taking off right now.
Yeah, this is the thing. It's the one that could actually take off because it could work, and it's just it combined all of the things that worked in all the previous ones. And what would you say is the is the key thing that Bitcoin introduced that allowed it to make all of these things work? Is there the
I mean, the one that's often mentioned, and I would say I agree with, like, the one new thing, the thing that Satoshi really embedded that wasn't done before, is difficulty adjustment, right?
Yep, that's my favorite.
Yeah. So after, if coins are being produced too fast, basically, then it would become harder to produce more coins, and that's that's how you ensure that there's a limited supply.
Yeah, I really think difficulty adjustment is the most significant thing.
I should correct that. It doesn't. You could still have a limited supply without a difficulty adjustment. It ensured that there's a predictable rate of inflation, or a predictable rate of money coming into circulation.
Yeah, and it does that without having to centralize the money. That's
Right.
the only way that you can do it, to change the difficulty of the mining and adjust it for the whole network. I think combining the all of the innovations that you mentioned on cryptography and digital cash and so on, all of that could only really work if you combine it with a distributed network, peer-to-peer network, and then had a money supply that was common, that they all agreed on the same ledger, the same money transaction. That was the really genius idea. And then to make the supply schedule determined by the difficulty of mining meant that you didn't have to trust any authority with how much it mines. And that really is, for me, I think, the magical thing. I said it, I think I said it in the Bitcoin Standard, maybe I just said it on Twitter, but I think it's the most innovative, it's the most important innovation that is added to Bitcoin, the difficulty adjustment. And what it really does is create the most advanced form of money that we've ever had. And that's really what I do in the Bitcoin Standard. It's 7 chapters of explaining the history of money to arrive at the issue of difficulty, the difficulty of money, the difficulty of money, the difficulty of money. And then Satoshi Nakamoto comes up with this new thing, which is called the difficulty adjustment, which ensures that no matter how hard people try to mine this money, they continue to get the same amount that he had pre-programmed into this thing. And it's absolutely amazing, because the more you do it, the more people get into the network, the supply remains the same. And that just makes a whole new, different animal in terms of money. It's completely different from anything that we had before. If we had 5 people around the world using Bitcoin, we'd only have 450 Bitcoins being produced today. If we had 5 billion people using Bitcoin, we'd also have only 450 Bitcoins produced today. It's really incredible to think about it, that the supply is completely irresponsive to the demand. The network has no conception of how many people are out there. It doesn't care. It's just out there producing the same number of coins, and the whole world has to adjust.
Yeah, it's so for context, I briefly mentioned that, but so for example, RPow didn't have that stop on it. So with RPow, if there was more proof of work, there was just more money. And if computers get faster, and proof of work increased for that reason, there's more money. And because of that, there was no incentive to actually accept the money in the first place, right? Why would you want to accept a currency that's going to be that is going to be inflated? Like, you wouldn't want to accept that. And if no one's accepting it, well, then there's even less reason to have the money because you can't spend it anywhere. No one's going to want it. So the incentives for RPow, like the technology worked. The technology was, for the most part at least, and it was functional. It was, like Hal Finney actually ran it for a while. It was out there. It could be used, and some people used it, mostly just for experimenting and to sort of play around with. But it was live. But the incentives just didn't add up. There was no reason for people to adopt it. And yes, I think we're in complete agreement on that. That one of the arguably the most important thing that Satoshi got right was the incentives, and that has everything to do with the difficulty adjustment and making sure that the supply is limited and the inflation rate is predictable. Like that's arguably the most important new idea that was introduced in Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin wouldn't have been possible without all the other ideas, but yeah, it's crucial that to get the incentives right.
Yeah, I think this is the glue that holds all of these other ideas together. This is how you're able to put cryptography and digital cash and proof of work and peer-to-peer networks. The glue that makes it all stick together is that you need to keep the supply increase controlled so that people have an incentive to mine, but also people have an incentive to hold, more importantly. If people don't have an incentive to hold, then the entire thing falls apart. The holders are the thing that keeps the whole thing going. And this is it. If you imagine if Bitcoin was going to, if Satoshi had read Keynesian economics and he decided that the supply is going to have to grow by how much the network is going to grow. And so he assumed, let's say 20% per year supply growth or 30% per year supply growth. And he just programmed it to go that way. You would have been buying a Bitcoin in 2010, knowing that every year you're going to be diluted by 20-30% in terms of your supply. So in terms of the your share of the total supply. And so the increase in the demand is going to have to outweigh that. So the reason, the incentive to buy at an early stage is massively undermined if you have high inflation. And that's why our POW didn't take off, and all these other examples can't really take off, because if you don't have a strong incentive for people to hold, then the whole thing doesn't work. And this is why Bitcoin's gone from $0 to $2 trillion in 15 years. It's really incredible. It's amazing these things work.
Yeah, so the way I see it, or as I wrote the book also, like a bit, the point of the two storylines is, I think even today, there's sort of two people that are attracted to Bitcoin, or at least it sort of was that way, and or that have a different main interest in Bitcoin. So on the one hand, it's people like you, like the economists, the Austrian economists, that really see Bitcoin sort of through that lens. And then you have the more hacker types and the more privacy activists. I think these have always sort of been, in Bitcoin they come together, they sort of merge, but they're still like people kind of came for different reasons. At least historically, I would argue that has been the case. And I do think these two really need each other. So the more techies, the hackers, so to say, they really need Bitcoin's incentives to work out. Like they need these monetary incentives to play out, because if you don't have that, then you end up with RPow. Like it works technically, but no one's going to use it. So what did you win? Nothing, right? Or DigiCash is an even better example. Like it worked. It had great privacy. There was nothing wrong with the technology. Even today, you're right. There's new projects on top of Bitcoin that just are reusing this eCash technology from 40 years ago. So the technology works, but people will only use it if the incentives are there. Now, on the other hand, sort of the more economic types, there are also examples, like the first example in the book of e-gold, right? There were digital cash projects that used gold as backing. So if you just want these sort of monetary incentives, then that also existed. But that also failed because the technology was too centralized and therefore it could be shut down. So these two sort of sides really kind of need each other. The techies need the monetary incentives, and the more monetary people need the technology for it to not be shut down.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this harmony. I see it.
Yeah, and you need both in order to really be able to enjoy the Bitcoin experience. I speak from bitter experience because I first I heard of Bitcoin was from the lens of this is a digital gold, and I continued to dismiss it for a very long time because I was not familiar with the technical aspect, and I had the academic arrogance to think that I could dismiss things that I didn't really understand. Because why would you want to waste time understanding them and understanding the technical side, which is an irrelevant detail, obviously, compared to my big-brained economic stakes. And it's the same form of derangement that you see all over with people who have very strong opinions about Bitcoin but can't tell you anything about how it works. And it really took me just shutting up and sitting down and reading and trying to understand how this thing works. And only then do you truly get to understand what's actually going on. Because saying, no matter how much you understand the economic aspect, you understand the Austrian perspective, you understand how great a fixed money supply is, unless you really look under the hood, you can't really grasp the idea that this thing truly exists outside of the state. You can't really grasp the idea that you can actually create an account on an offline computer. This is how decentralized this thing is. Any computer can download the software to create a Bitcoin address and Bitcoin wallet, and you can keep the code on an offline computer, and the network will still know that your address is there. It's almost like magic. So that doesn't make sense. If that doesn't register, then you continuously think this is just going to be another e-gold, another Liberty dollar. They're going to shut it down. They're going to find a way. There are people behind it. We can find them. There are exchanges that sell it. We can find them. And it's very difficult to grasp the idea that no, this cat can actually leave the bag. And in fact, it is out of the bag already. And it's probably become too big for them to do anything to meaningfully stop it. And the risk of missing out on it at this point is a lot bigger than the risk of being wiped out by it because of government banning it or whatever. And that you have to get the technical aspect.
Yeah, although I wouldn't say I'm not 100% convinced that that is really true. I do think Bitcoin can still fail. Like there are still, there are centralization pressures, and I do see, I especially if people sort of become complacent, then I do think there are failure scenarios for Bitcoin. The most obvious one is if mining becomes too centralized and censorship is imposed, or if nodes become too centralized. Now we've mostly been able to prevent that probably because during the block size wars by keeping nodes cheap enough for regular people to run, but that could have ended differently potentially. So yeah, I do think it requires ongoing vigilance to some extent to keep Bitcoin working. I don't really see it as a technology that's unstoppable yet, and maybe will never be. Like, this is what Satoshi also said, right? One of the Satoshi quotes is, "It's opened up a new a new front on the battle of freedom," or something.
Yeah.
That quote, I do think that's a good quote. That is sort of how I see it. I don't see Bitcoin as a foregone conclusion, as a success. It will require vigilance to some extent to keep it separated from the state, essentially, and to stop it from failing altogether.
Yeah, and I agree. I think I may have overstated my level of confidence, but I think it's still the point still stands that you need to familiarize yourself with the technical side of things to get to the realization that this thing can work. I should say, not necessarily will, definitely 100% work. You never know, but it's always good to give no pointers the impression that they have hope, so that we can crush it.
Well, so far so good, at least.
Yeah, so far so good. Couldn't have asked for more, really. Well, I mean, could maybe 10x nine. Could always ask for a 10x bigger would be nicer. Would bring us
Don't get
closer to
too
the end
greedy.
of it.
Don't get too greedy, Safe.
Well, I mean, it's not so much greed; it's just it would bring us
Stay
closer to
humble.
the to the end of Fiat. That's the point. The faster number goes up, the faster that Fiat dies. Okay, what about the crypto wars? Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of the crypto wars?
I mean, relevant that you bring up that topic after what we were just discussing.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean the crypto wars of the '90s. That was a interesting time for the cypherpunks in particular. So what happened was the cypherpunks were just founded. So the cypherpunks, as I explained, it was this group of hackers, privacy activists, cryptographers, and they recognized the potential of cryptography. They saw the promise of the internet. They expected the internet to become big as it is today. But they were concerned that depending on how the internet evolves, that could lead to the internet could become some sort of big panopticon, right? Like basically the Snowden revelations, where everything you do online can be tracked and monitored and analyzed. Now the cypherpunks they wanted to prevent that, so they saw that dystopian future, and they wanted this Orwellian 1984's future, and they wanted to prevent that. So they set out, and the way they wanted to do it was to actually build the tools that people could use to protect themselves, essentially, right? Like PGP, like so encryption software to communicate privately, and indeed digital cash. Now, right after they were founded, the Clinton administration came into power, and they essentially opened up a frontal attack against cryptography. Most relevantly, the PGP software was banned from exports. So you couldn't ban. Am I saying that right? There was also the algorithm. The name is slipping my mind. Anyways, they were trying to prevent the spread of strong cryptography. And so the cypherpunks started to fight back against that. So indeed, one of the ways they did that was to actually, just write the code and spread it across. But they also applied other forms of activism. So a famous example is Adam Back's T-shirt that printed the RSA algorithm. That's what I was looking for, the RSA algorithm.
yes,
The RSA algorithm was banned from being exported. And because it was embedded in the PGP software, and the PGP software was available online and could therefore be downloaded anywhere, Phil Zimmerman, the developer of the PGP software, he was considered in breach of the law because it was not allowed to export this. So Adam Back started to print this on a T-shirt, and then to sort of point out the insane nature of these kinds of laws. So if you would cross the border from the United States, out of the United States, let's say you walk to Mexico, then by the letter of the law, you were a weapons exporter. There was also the Clipper chip. So the story of the Clipper chip was, this was a chip developed by the NSA, and they wanted phones to be embedded with this chip. The government wanted all phones to be embedded with this chip. It was kind of promoted as a way to offer security or to offer encryption, because the chip would encrypt, your phone calls. However, there was a backdoor in it, so the government, if they wanted to, they could listen in to phone calls. So this was another thing that the cypherpunks were very against. Like, they wanted to explicitly, prevent the government from listening in. Like, that was the main the party they did not want to, snoop on your communication, which is, logically that should be your main concern, because what entity can do the most harm, what entity can do the most evil, it is big governments, right? Like big fascist governments, for example, they are exactly who you want to protect yourself from. So this idea of having a government backdoor completely defeated the point of using encryption in the first place to a large extent. So yeah, right after cypherpunks were founded, the crypto war started. The Clinton administration tried to prevent the spread of strong cryptography, and the cypherpunks started to fight back. And one of the interesting things, like, is this really one of these David versus Goliath type of real life stories, is that they actually ended up winning. Like, they won that battle in the 90s. That's why today we can use cryptography. That's why we can have encrypted apps on our phones, or HTTPS websites that have encrypted connections. Like, all of these things were possible because the cypherpunks started to fight back. It wasn't just the cypherpunks. It was also there were also commercial interests. Like, Netscape couldn't export their browsers. They couldn't sell their browsers abroad because they were using encryption. It was also like human rights types of groups, like the ACLU, that wanted to protect privacy rights of Americans. But the cypherpunks, the way Tim May described it, they were kind of the radical arm of it. So they were like like you had the Black Panthers during the Civil Rights Movement, like the more radical arm, and he saw the cypherpunks as that during the crypto wars, like this decentralized, faceless, nameless group of radicals that were just building this code, spreading it, and basically not caring what the government thought of that as online activists. So yeah, that's they were sort of this David and the Goliath story, and they won. That's but now, yeah, now I really think now we're seeing kind of a resurgence of this, both when it comes to actual encryption itself, right? There's more pressure in more parts of the world to start either banning or having backdoors in chat apps. Of course, in some countries that's already the case. So there, and also when it comes to digital, crypto in the sense of cryptocurrency, we're seeing that now with the rest of Tornado Cash, the Tornado Cash developers, and the Samurai Wallet developers that are being prosecuted. The way I see it, I really see it as a sort of second crypto war that's starting to emerge.
Yeah, although I mean, looks like just like with most of Bitcoin's wars, the opposition submits before firing many shots, and so the U.S. government seems to have learned the lesson very quickly. They've elected Donald Trump, who seems to be probably putting an end to this. I'm wondering, what do you think?
I would be very happily surprised if that's the case. I have not seen any signs of that. I do think, he's relatively crypto friendly. I think that's fair to say. And, he's talking about, he's trying to, or at least he says he's going to prevent the harassment of miners, which would be good. Like, just let miners, be a company and use the energy that they're willing to pay for. Like, these kind of measures would be really good. Strategic Bitcoin reserve, I don't actually have a very strong opinion on that. If they want to do it, that's up to them. I'm not against it, let's be clear, but I'm also not necessarily in favor of it. But no, I really hope that he would also stop the prosecution of these privacy technologies. I've seen no indication that will happen. It will be a positive surprise for me if it does.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's only been 2 weeks and he's had bigger fish to fry. But it does seem like it seems like if you're in the US government and you are going after crypto, you probably are really scared of messing around now, because I mean, a big part of the platform was fire Gary Gensler day one. So anybody who's going after any of those things might not find themselves in the in the right books of the new administration. I guess one way of looking at it. Also, the launching of a shitcoin, I mean, as grotesque as it is, it's really open season. It's telling people that it's open season for anything crypto related. Which, you know, if you're thinking of it from a government regulation perspective, you might think, well, that's terrible because now everybody's going to introduce their own shitcoin and it's going to be bad. But from an economic perspective, I think this is likely going to accelerate the death of the shitcoin industrial complex, because the more legal and the clearer and the easier it is for people to launch these shitcoins, the more shitcoins you're going to get. And there's going to be a massive inflation, and all the people who are into gambling on those things will eventually get their money taken away from them. And then, you know, the industry as an idea, it's just going to die. People are going to eventually realize there is no second best. Doesn't matter if who the person issuing the token is. It's a pump and dump, and it's going to die eventually, because nobody wants to run a network that is controlled by somebody else compared to a network that's truly decentralized. So
yeah, the emergence of pump.fun. Have you been keeping track of that at all?
no, what's that?
It's really the natural evolution of shitcoinery. It's like the time preference are getting shorter and shorter.
Exactly.
So now with what pump.fun was it was basically a merger of streaming and launching shitcoins. So streamers, you know, you would just sort of stream yourself or something while you were launching a meme coin, essentially. And it was really just based on attracting attention. You know, if you were attracting attention with your stream, then, you know, people would, for some reason, start to buy this coin a bit. Probably, you know, a bit of a Keynesian beauty contest thing where you think, well, if other people are going to be interested in the stream, then the coin will go up. We both agree this makes no sense, but, you know, that's sort of how these people are thinking on this.
That's just Ethereum, basically, but much faster.
Right, it's just going much more rapid. Like, that's what I'm saying. It's like the evolution of that going to its logical conclusions. But what you got in the end with that, and that's why they shut it down in the end. But you know, if the incentive is to attract attention, and there were basically no regulations, what you got was pretty bad stuff, like people threatening to commit suicide, or just sort of blindly shooting guns out of windows, or I think there was like animal porn on there, or like whatever attracted attention was you know, the more attention you attract, the better your coin will do. And it was like the peak shit coineries. Like that's where it leads if you have this, you know, short pump and dump mentality. It really leads to that sort of environment.
It really is. It's just taking the process of shitcoinery much faster. And I think, you know, this 21st century, we saw shitcoinery. In the 20th century was a government would print money over many years and decades and destroy the currency. And then in the 21st century, we saw it happen over a few years with shitcoins. And now with meme coins, it happens over minutes.
Yeah, over
amazing.
hours. Yes.
Technology is incredible. But, you know, we're coming up on about 40 million shitcoins at this point. There are 40 million shitcoins.
Oh, is anyone still keeping count? Yeah, I guess.
Apparently somebody made a study, and there's about 40 million coming up, which is great. I think, I mean, yeah, I see what you mean. And I think, yeah, so as a libertarian, you're not a fan of government banning things, but that does not mean that as a libertarian you expect that in a free society that such behavior would go completely without consequence. I think in a free society people would band into voluntary associations that prevent this kind of behavior. So if you want to deal with decent banks, if you want to deal with good investment firms, you can't be engaged in these sort of things. So there would be restrictions against this. And I think in a free market, you'd have much more complex mechanisms for keeping this kind of behavior at bay. The problem is that when things get centralized in the hands of a government, and there's no opting in or out, in the sense that you can't just decide, all right, I'm going to be part of this jurisdiction versus that jurisdiction, where people don't really have this right of self-determination to secede from a territory if they want to, and you're forced to be under a certain jurisdiction. Then people just switch to this mentality that if it's legal, then it's okay, and if it's illegal, then it's not okay. And morality is essentially replaced with legality. And I think this is where the role of regulation becomes more and more dangerous, because people shut off their critical thinking because they think if something is available, then that means somebody somewhere out there must have okayed it, so it's okay for me to use it. When if you didn't have that regulatory nanny state, then people would have a much healthier, paranoid, cynical mentality of, just because this thing is online and I can click on it and I can send it money, doesn't mean that it's going to work. I need to be careful. I need to try and analyze and think about those things first.
Yeah, I would say that's an optimistic expectation. I'm not sure if I completely agree with that. I mean, I agree with the risk of overregulation and centralization in that sense. I'm just not as convinced of the self-regulating mechanics, I think, of all scenarios like this. Like the example you mentioned of like private insurance sort of restraining these kinds of things. I don't know. I don't know if I would completely go along with that. I don't know. You would have to go into more detail if you really want to dive into that, of how that would work or why that would work.
Yeah, I discussed this in more detail in Principles of Economics in my last 3 chapters of that book. It's also out in Dutch, by the way. You can order it in Dutch if you want. So essentially, I think the Austrian view that I try and present in in Principles of Economics in the last few chapters is to think of all of these things that you traditionally associate as being necessarily governmental roles as just being economic goods. You want information about things that you invest in. You want to be protected from people who are going to assault you or kill you or take your stuff. And that is an economic good. That's an economic good, no different from corn, no different from, well, I mean, obviously it is different from corn, but in its fundamental essence of being an economic good, all of these things are similar. They are scarce. We want more of them than there is available. So we need to economize. And how do we economize? We make valuation, we compare valuation of different things, and we make our decisions at the margin. That's how human beings act. And so all of these things, we are capable of having markets in them where people are able to make valuation and exchange at the margin. So security is something that can be provided privately, individually, voluntarily, or as part of larger groups.
I mean, kind of, but there is a real problem with that, which you do see in like underdeveloped countries, for example, where, how do you know that your bodyguard isn't going to turn against you? He's the guy with the guns. You may be paying him, but, if he uses a gun against you, maybe he's earning more. And if there's no, state or higher sort of level that can find this guy and prosecute him and use their even bigger guns against him, then, it doesn't always work out that way.
No, it doesn't. And what happens when the guy turns against you? He is the state. So we agree on the problem. It's just you think that the state is the solution
Right.
here. I think the state is the problem.
Well, so I would say that's why over the centuries we've developed like the checks and balances and the fundamental rights and the division
but
of
the way I see it,
like all of these things are sort of intended to protect the state from becoming this guy. Is it perfect? No, but that's at least the idea. And in some countries, I would say it works pretty well.
I would say that it's the other way around. I would say that these concepts are what get people to essentially become more and more trusting of this bodyguard who's gone rogue, effectively. So if you think of him as a bodyguard who's got rogue, you've got a healthier relationship with the state than if you think of him as somebody who works for you. Because if you think of him as somebody who works for you, you're going to be running into a lot of disappointment in life generally.
Oh,
So
I definitely think that the power of the state should be treated with a lot of distrust. I'm just not personally of the school of thought that the state should therefore be abolished, because it's kind of what you say. I think you're just going to end up reinventing a state, really. And now we've got, at least in some countries, states where we've got pretty good protections when it comes to property rights and other types of rights, rights of free speech.
yeah, but
And
in fact, in these places, I think it's really society that developed those things, and the state is what violates them. So if you look around in Europe today, it's the state that's the biggest violator of property rights. The state takes a very large chunk of your income. The state takes a lot of your stuff, and the state confiscates property for all kinds of reasons at all points in time. And the way that I see it is that it's society that produced the value, society that accumulates capital, society that builds these norms of behavior, most importantly, the concept of property rights. It's not the state that enforces it. I think the state gains its legitimacy from uh, raising the banner of property rights. It says that we're going to do the thing that is just, therefore we are legitimate. But in my mind, the way that I see it is, if people are bamboozled into thinking of the state as being us, if people use the term we when they refer to their government, then they've been effectively scammed. They've now
why?
accepted, because now you've accepted the idea that this entity can take my stuff and do what it wants because it's out there looking out for me. If you think of it as them, then you have a much healthier understanding and you're less likely to be scammed. So there, it's them. So I
mean,
need to
you
pay
have
them enough. I need to pay them enough to stay out of prison, but I'm not expecting them to satisfy my goals in life, to meet the things that I want. You have to rely on yourself. You have to depend on yourself. And I think the state is, as it becomes less voluntary and as it becomes more imposing and more authoritarian and more totalitarian, it loses more and more of this legitimacy, and it becomes more and more of a burden rather than an asset. And here I think I go back to Mises in those chapters. His criteria is what determines whether the state is a force for good or for evil, is whether people have the right to self-determination, whether people can secede. So if you're able to have a village get out of a country or a region declare its independence and leave a country, then that government is likely going to be relatively legitimate, because obviously you can't break it down to a small, very individual level. But you look at the example of Liechtenstein. This is how Liechtenstein functions. So Liechtenstein is a tiny country, but it's 11 villages in the country, and each one of those villages can choose to secede and become independent, or join Austria or join Switzerland, the neighboring countries. And so effectively, they are choosing to be part of this government. They're choosing to be part of this country. They're accepting the idea of this government. So therefore, this keeps the government in check. And this makes it so that really they need to provide a certain level of service, or it becomes more, it makes more sense for the government, for people to join another government or start their own. So in places where you have that, you're more likely to see the government act as a service provider, where people aren't bamboozled by the sense that this is we and we have to change it. Where it's, what, if you don't like this stuff, let's just join the other country, or let's just declare our own. So if you have the right of self-determination accepted, then governments can become more like legitimate service providers, because people can just opt out. But if you're born and you have to stay in it, and if you ever challenge your government's sanctity and their territory, and if you ever suggest that maybe you want to secede or join another country, then you get thrown in prison and murdered, then you are living in a dystopian hellhole that needs to be dismantled.
Yeah, I think we do find a point of agreement there. You also see that in the most totalitarian states, it's usually the hardest to get out. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I think that's something I agree with. I don't know if I completely agree on this idea that the state is not a we by definition. I probably more than you think that some democracies are relatively functional and people have a say in how
Yeah.
their country is governed. But the point of succession and leaving, that's a point I definitely agree with.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. Any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to leave us with about your book, or more generally your other work?
No, this was fun. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure.
Any final thoughts? No, I think I'm good.
Excellent. Well, where can people find more of your work? As you said, Bitcoin Magazine, right?
Yeah, Bitcoin Magazine. So the book is called the Genesis Book, which you can find also on the Bitcoin Magazine store or just Amazon or wherever. I'm on X, which is at Aaron van W. I'm actually more on Nostr, but I don't know an easy way to share it on a podcast other than go to my X account and there I link to my Nostr public key. I have a podcast as well called Bitcoin Explained, which is technical with Josh Provost, one of the Bitcoin core developers. We don't make a ton of episodes anymore, but it's still out there. And once in a while, there will be something, we discuss what's in new Bitcoin core releases or some sort of technical aspect of Bitcoin for the people that find that interesting.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for the book and for joining us today.
Thanks, Saif.
Cheers. Take care.